You're listening to Missing in Color, a podcast dedicated to highlighting overlooked true crime cases and missing persons involving communities of color. Because every case deserves to be seen. Hi, everyone. My name is Anaya. I'm your host, and welcome to Missing in Color. This podcast was created to highlight overlooked true crime cases and missing persons involving communities of color, especially the stories that deserved far more attention than they received. Each week, we'll cover cases that impacted real families and real communities, while also bringing awareness to current missing persons cases that may not be receiving widespread media coverage. Because every case deserves to be seen. Now, let's get into today's case. On January 26, 2009, police in Upper Marlboro, Maryland received a disturbing 911 call from a young woman claiming that she and her mother had been shot inside their home. But by the time officers arrived at the scene, both women were already dead. The two victims were identified as 45-year-old Karen Lofton and her 16-year-old daughter, Karissa Lofton. Karen Lofton was born Karen Antoinette Sherrill Lofton on May 31, 1963. Living in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, Karen was known as a hardworking nurse and a devoted mother to her three children, 23-year-old Kirkland Jr., 20-year-old Keon, and 16-year-old Karissa. Karen was a DMV native, born and raised in the area by her godmother, Catherine. She grew up on South Dakota Avenue Northeast in the heart of Washington, D.C. And although Karen did not grow up with much, those who knew her described her as a kind-hearted person, always willing to help others without expecting anything in return. And that kindness seemed to follow Karen throughout her entire life. From an early age, Karen dreamed of becoming a nurse. And after high school, she attended the University of District of Columbia, where she earned her associate's degree before continuing her education at Howard University, where she received her bachelor's degree in nursing. Now, I gotta interrupt, y'all, because your girl here is a Howard grad herself, and you know once a bison, always a bison. So shout out to my fellow bison out there if you're listening. After graduating, Karen began her nursing career at DC General Hospital before later transferring to Howard University Hospital. There, she worked as a medical ICU nurse for nearly 10 years. Even after stepping away from bedside nursing, Karen continued caring for others. She later worked as a nursing staff coordinator at an elder care facility while also running both a CPR training business and a gift basket and flower arrangement company. So this company was called Kikokas Gifts and Flowers, and she created that name by combining a few letters from each of her children's names. So Karen was clearly a busy woman, but despite everything on her plate, she was also known as a devoted mother and wife. Karen met her husband Kirkland while attending 7th grade at Taft Junior High School. The two continued dating throughout high school before Kirkland later joined the military for 4 years after graduation. When he returned home, the couple married and eventually welcomed the three children together, Kirkland Jr., Keon, and Karissa. The family lived in a pale green 2-story home on Southall Drive, large enough for each of the children to have their own bedroom, which, for Karen, again, not growing up with much, that had to be so fulfilling to be able to provide that for her children. Now, later, Karen and Kirkland divorced in 2004 after nearly 19 years together, but the two remained in contact and continued to co-parent their children. Karissa, the couple's only daughter, was described as a true fashionista. From a young age, she loved fashion and reportedly preferred wearing dresses whenever she could and would throw a fit if she was told to wear pants. And fashion seemed to run in the family, as Kirkland's relatives owned 2 tailor shops in the DMV area. Inspired by the environment, Karissa dreamed of pursuing a career in fashion and hoped to attend college in Atlanta after graduation. But as we now know, Karissa would never get the chance to fulfill that dream. It was January 26, 2009, and for the Lofton family, the day had seemed completely normal. Karen had recently accepted a new position as a school nurse at Lake Arbor Elementary School in Mitchellville, and she had just completed her orientation for the role. That night, Karen's second oldest son, Keon, was away from the home, staying with his fiancée, leaving Karen and Karissa alone together. Now, at approximately 2:30 a.m., Karissa dialed 911. She said, "Ma'am, I've been shot. Me and my mother have been shot. I'm bleeding to death." Police were dispatched immediately and arrived at the scene in less than 5 minutes, but unfortunately, it was already too late. When the officers arrived, they found the front door locked, and after searching the property, one officer located an unlocked window and climbed inside the home. Inside, police discovered Carissa's body in her bed underneath the covers, while Karen's body was located in another room. Investigators determined that Karissa had been shot multiple times while lying in bed. Karen appeared to have been shot while attempting to hide from the intruder. An initial search of the home revealed 6 spent shell casings from a Glock 17 handgun. Other than the murders themselves, investigators found little evidence of a break-in or a robbery. In fact, the alarm system had been disabled. Nothing appeared to have been stolen from the home, leaving police without a clear motive. Prince George's County Police began their investigation by looking at those closest to Karen and Karissa. One of the first people questioned was 20-year-old Keon, who had been living in the home while attending college. After hearing about the murders, Keon rushed back home and informed investigators that he had been spending the night at his fiance's house. And after some questioning, Keon was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Karen's ex-husband Kirkland was also investigated. At the time of the murders, he had been living in Atlanta, working as a tailor. He had recently traveled to Washington, D.C., and he was there earlier that week on a Thursday for the presidential inauguration. He had visited the family home before returning back to Atlanta. Meanwhile, the couple's oldest son, Kirkland Jr., had long since moved out of the family home. He was a married man and had fathered his own daughter, so now he was living with his family elsewhere in Washington, D.C. With the immediate family members seemingly accounted for, investigators found themselves without both a suspect and a motive. So they began asking around the neighborhood to see if anyone had seen anything unusual on the night of the murders. Investigators found a neighbor that lived 2 doors down from the Loftons that claimed to have seen a blue vehicle parked on the right side of the road that night. Outside of the neighbor's tip, the investigators did not have much evidence to go on at this point. They assumed that Karen and Karissa knew their killer due to the lack of forced entry. However, this was earlier debunked by confirming the alibis of the family members. This did not stop investigators. Without evidence suggesting otherwise, they continued to pursue that theory. Now, Karen and Carissa's murders are unsolved at this point, and their family and community is just grieving, and it's just general confusion going on. I mean, like, who could have wanted to murder this mother and daughter? They had no known enemies, and the case remained stagnant until about 7 weeks later. Then, on March 16, 2009, police received a call from a woman reporting that someone had stolen her car from her carport. Now, I had to look this up because I had honestly never heard the word carport before. Growing up in Georgia and the metro Atlanta area, I'm used to driveways and garages, but apparently it's basically a covered parking space attached to a house. So, while speaking to police on the phone, the woman suddenly saw her own car speed past her, and she is literally heard on the call saying, "That's my car." Okay, it just zoomed past me, which is honestly terrifying. The vehicle was later discovered engulfed in flames in the driveway of a vacant home. And get this, that home was located only 2 blocks away from Karen and Karissa Lofton's home. Once firefighters got the flames under control, investigators made a horrifying discovery inside the vehicle: 2 burned bodies located in the trunk. The victims were later identified as 42-year-old Deloris DeWitt and her 19-year-old daughter, Ebony DeWitt. At this point, investigators immediately noticed the similarities between this case and the one just a few months prior. This was now the second mother-daughter pair murdered within weeks of each other in the same area. And just like Karen Lofton, Deloris DeWitt was also a nurse. The similarities between these cases were honestly eerie. Deloris was described as outgoing and deeply loved by both her family and the elderly patients she cared for at the nursing home where she worked. Ebony, meanwhile, was remembered as vibrant and full of life. Autopsies later revealed that both women had been strangled and had likely been dead for about a day before their bodies were discovered. Ebony's boyfriend was one of the last people to see her alive. He told investigators he had dropped her off at home the night before and noted that she had been wearing her favorite blue sweater. That detail would later become very important. The scene inside the DeWitt home was eerily similar to the Lofton crime scene. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The only major difference was the method of murder. Unlike Karen and Karissa, Deloris and Ebony had not been shot. Unfortunately, because of the fire damage inside the vehicle, investigators struggled to determine whether the murders had occurred inside the home or somewhere else entirely. But investigators did recover one important piece of evidence. Inside a section of Deloris's jeans, detectives discovered leaves from a beech tree. Now, this was huge because investigators reportedly could not find any beech trees in the immediate area where the bodies had been discovered. So this suggested that the murders may have occurred somewhere else before the bodies were moved. Still, despite that clue, the case stalled once again. About 3 months into the investigation, detectives decided to basically start from scratch. They retraced their steps, reviewed old evidence, and even announced a $25,000 reward for information leading to a conviction. Investigators also started exploring whether the murders could somehow be connected to a string of burglaries happening throughout the area. And that theory eventually led them to a man named Jason Scott. Scott was arrested by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives after attempting to sell a firearm to an informant. And honestly, before researching this case, I had no idea that that bureau even existed. At first glance, Jason Scott did not fit the image many people would expect. Authorities described him as quiet and almost timid. He had no real criminal history. He graduated college, and he worked part-time for UPS. According to investigators, Jason Scott barely spoke above a whisper. But they quickly realized that there was something much darker underneath that image. In exchange for possible leniency, Scott agreed to cooperate with the investigators. During questioning, he provided authorities with a list of nearly 40 homes that he had burglarized throughout the Prince George's County. 40 homes, y'all. That is a lot. And according to investigators, some of those burglaries became incredibly violent. Scott allegedly admitted to waking homeowners at gunpoint during several break-ins. And at that point, investigators realized they were potentially dealing with far more than simple weapons charges. When investigators searched Scott's home, they discovered disturbing home videos that revealed another side of him entirely. Some reportedly showed Scott secretly filming people through their windows while they're changing clothes or preparing for bed. So, Jason Scott is a peeping Tom. And one of his accomplices later described him as sensitive but crazy. And that description alone says a lot. That same accomplice also claimed Scott would often steal car keys during their burglaries, return later to steal the vehicles, and then abandon them elsewhere. And that sounded exactly like what happened in the DeWitt case. But the biggest breakthrough came when Scott mentioned something investigators would later refer to as the spooky house. According to Scott and his accomplices, the home was a vacant mansion where they would divide stolen property after the burglaries. When investigators searched this property, they discovered critical evidence connected to the murders. Among the evidence recovered were charred remains of a blue sweater matching the same one Ebony DeWitt had reportedly been wearing before her death. Investigators also recovered beech tree leaves and fabric consistent with the jeans Deloris had been wearing. At that point, investigators realized they had likely uncovered the location connected to the murders. But the evidence against Jason Scott continued to grow. One accomplice told investigators that about a month before Deloris and Ebony were murdered, He and Scott had been running through yards after committing a burglary when Scott suddenly stopped in his tracks after noticing Ebony inside her home. The accomplice also claimed Scott had been near the Lofton residence around the time Karen and Karissa were murdered. Additionally, he stated that Scott had been carrying a Glock 17 handgun, the same type of weapon used in the Lofton killings. Investigators later traced the Glock 17 used in the murders back to a weapon Jason Scott had previously stolen during one of his burglaries. Ballistics testing ultimately connected the gun to the shell casings recovered from the Lofton crime scene. So this seems like an open and shut case. Investigators truly believed that they had found the person responsible. And on September 2nd, 2009, Jason Scott was arrested for the murders of Deloris and Ebony DeWitt. Deloris' surviving sister, Patricia Smith, later said that she was grateful investigators had kept their promise to solve the case. But unfortunately, the story does not fully end there for Karen and Karissa Lofton. Although investigators strongly believed that Jason Scott was responsible for their murders, prosecutors ultimately decided not to pursue charges in the Lofton case because they had already had enough evidence to convict him in the DeWitt murders. So Scott remained in custody while awaiting trial, but in 2013, his initial trial ended in a mistrial after a detective referenced additional home invasions during the testimony. Later that year, Scott entered an Alford plea, meaning he did not formally admit guilt, but acknowledged that the prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him of the crime. As part of the plea agreement, charges connected to the murders of Karen and Karissa Lofton were dropped. The plea agreement also included the 2008 murder of 46-year-old Velma Butler, whose home had been set on fire after she was killed. Jason Scott will ultimately receive decades in prison for the murders of Deloris and Ebony DeWitt, along with additional time connected to his firearms charges. For the murders, Jason received 85 years, and then he received an additional 100 years for those weapons charges. Unfortunately, he was never formally convicted in the case of Karen and Karissa. For the Lofton family, that missing conviction leaves behind lingering questions and an incomplete sense of justice. And for many people in Prince George's County, the murders of these two mother-daughter pairs remain some of the most disturbing crimes the community has ever seen. So I just want everyone listening to take a moment to honor these women whose lives were stolen through such senseless violence. Karen, Karissa, Ebony, Deloris, and Velma. They deserve to be remembered. And that was the case of Karen and Karissa Lofton. This has been Missing in Color, because every case deserves to be seen. Thank you, and I'll see you guys next time.